Hey, it's Ramsey Dewey. This time I'm over here in Anhui Province, China. I just finished up some commentary for Kunlun Fight here in the city of Tonglin. Beautiful lake in the background. And welcome to another edition of Q&A with the Coach. Our first question, let's check that out, comes from our friend Daniel Walker, who says, "Hey Ramsey, is Jujitsu originally from Japanese samurai?" Yes, Daniel, it is actually. The samurai were armed to the teeth. They generally carried 3 blades: the daito katana, the long sword, the wakizashi, the short sword, and the tanto, the dagger, among other weapons they used, such as bows and spears and things like that. But when you fight with melee weapons, when those weapons cross, it often becomes a grappling situation. There was a famous Italian swordsman who said something like this: in single rapier combat, that long single-handed sword they used to use in Europe, in single rapier combat, the better wrestler almost always kills his opponent. But if neither man knows how to wrestle, the stronger man almost always kills his opponent. And you might think, well, wait, don't they have swords? Yeah, they do. But as soon as those swords cross, you get awfully close to the other guy, and it potentially becomes a grappling situation. Samurai sword fighting is exactly the same, especially when they were kitted out in a suit of armor and hard to cut with those swords. So you can trace a lot of Jiu-Jitsu techniques, even Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques, back to... Whoa. Sorry about that, my phone popped out of the holder. You can trace a lot of those Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques back to Samurai Jiu-Jitsu. For example, the overhead strike with the sword is an extremely common technique. You can still see that in Kendo, Kenjutsu, those sword styles today. And as a response to that, instead of moving away, you've got to move up close to avoid the tail end of that blade, and so you can lock up figure 4 arm triangles around the head, use that as a takedown. And especially, again, if you're kitted out in armor with a helmet, yeah, that becomes much more viable against a sword than unarmored. So yeah, great question. Next. Our next question comes from our friend Brandon S., who says the following. He says, "Why isn't MMA more featured in China? Is it a censorship thing? But if so, why?" Okay, MMA is a relatively new sport in China. There have been MMA competitions for a little over a decade here in the People's Republic of China. I got into the MMA scene pretty early on, about 10 years ago, here in the PRC, and it was the Wild West. Nobody knew what was going on. The referees didn't know how to ref it. The judges didn't know how to judge it. The fighters didn't know how to fight it, if you will. But yeah, it's basically a brand new sport here. That being said, currently mixed martial arts is not televised in China. And that may be censorship. One thing I learned pretty early on is that they do not like to see blood on television. Let me amend that. Mixed martial arts is seldom televised here in China. For example, I worked for a all-women's MMA show called Heroin Fighting Championships up in Beijing as a referee a while back, and that one was televised. However, the way they filmed that one was way different than the way they normally film a live event, because they filmed it in front of a studio audience, and they did a lot of retakes and reshoots. Now, the fights were live, however, live with some addendums, if you will. So, for example, one fight that I reffed, a girl got a bloody nose, and I'm going to tell you, one thing I learned is they hate to see blood in China. They don't want to see that on television. So they want to censor out blood and gore and extreme violence and things like that. And this sun is beating off the top of my head, making it look like it's disappearing into the horizon. But this girl got a bloody nose, and it was nothing really serious, nothing to stop a fight over. However, the powers that be demanded that I stop this fight because of this bloody nose. And I was thinking, well, that's ridiculous. She can breathe. It's not getting in the way of the fight. It's not a threatening injury. It's just a little blood. But they wanted to shut that down immediately. And man, I got a stern talking to from the powers that be. We don't want to see blood in front of the cameras on this event. This is going out on TV. All these other admonitions. So, yeah, normally for an MMA fight, yeah, you're going to see a lot of incidental blood that you can't control. But yeah, they want to control that. Well, they want to censor that. Okay? Why else? Why else is MMA not huge? What sports are huge in China? Ping pong? Cricket? Those are the big ones. Badminton? Yeah, these sports that in other parts of the world aren't really that big of a deal. Their fun little hobbies are huge sports here in China. Skateboarding is a fairly new sport, but it has taken off quite a bit in the People's Republic of China. Basketball, largely thanks to Yao Ming, has skyrocketed in popularity here as well. MMA, on the other hand, not so much. It hasn't had the time to get a foothold on this country or this culture yet. Our next question comes from our friend Ruben, who has a question about strength. He's commenting on one of my old videos where I talk about the importance of strength training for martial arts, which is often neglected among martial artists. I went on to say martial artists are terrible athletes, generally speaking. Of course, there are plenty of exceptions to that. But yeah, in a lot of martial arts and combat sports, serious strength training is often discouraged, unfortunately. So Ruben says, if I can read this kind of a blurry screen, what kind of strength do you personally feel is the most important? Explosive strength, max strength, agile strength, or relative strength? All must surely be had to some degree or another, but which do you feel are the most important? Thanks for the reply. All right, Ruben, I'm glad you made distinctions between different types of strength. It's not just about your max bench press or whatever. Because strength is the precedent for all athletic performance. Speed, as you mentioned. Power, as you mentioned. Your ability to contract your muscles as much as possible, as you mentioned. Right? And as you mentioned, those are all important. But let me simplify it as much as possible. The most important strength for combat sports is postural strength. Your ability to bear and move weight while maintaining a straight line from your head, through your neck, through your spine, through your tailbone. Now make no mistake, there is a natural curvature, double curvature in the human spine, as there is in all mammals as far as I'm aware. But what I mean is if you were to draw a line from the tip of the head to the tailbone, if you can keep that line unbroken, unbent, unslumped, untwisted, with no torsion, that is good fight posture. Not to be mistaken with, good social posture, if you will. Pull the shoulders back, stand up tall, suck in your gut, whatever. That's not what I'm talking about. So your postural strength is largely going to come from two lifts, the squat and the deadlift. So if you don't do any other lifts, do those ones. Squats, deadlifts, study them religiously, do them religiously. The type of strength that those will build will carry over into everything else athletically that you do, especially in combat sports. Next. Our next question comes from Salem Fredrickson, who says, mainstream perception of martial arts has changed a lot in the last 20 years with the refining of MMA. Where do you think it will be in the future, and what could we do to make martial arts more effective for self-defense? Okay. Yeah, martial arts definitely has changed a lot in public perception. 20 years ago, the popular idea was that martial arts was magic. It was some type of magical spell that you cast with your hands to be able to allow a wimpy little guy to beat a big tough guy or something like that, or use your chi energy to become indestructible or, again, gain magic powers. That was the popular idea when I was a kid. And maybe that's me looking at it through childhood nostalgia. But I still meet a lot of people, grown adults, who still view martial arts through that lens. When I say martial arts, I'm generally talking about fighting. Winning fights through hand-to-hand combat. Or weapons combat. You know, fighting. But when a lot of people hear martial arts, they think of putting on a costume, a gi or a dobok or some uniform, strapping on a belt, going to a dojo, bowing to a flag, bowing to your sensei, doing forms, hopping around, and then arguing online about who does it better. My style of karate is superior to your style of karate. No, Kung Fu is better than Taekwondo. No, Taekwondo is better than whatever. And that's happening. I would like to think that in 20 years that nonsense is going to stop, but probably not. Probably not, because we're always going to get new humans who don't know any better. So, can we make martial arts more effective for self-defense? Yeah, we absolutely can. Bearing in mind that martial arts is not the end-all, be-all of self-defense. Self-defense is a lot more than combat. But when it comes down to combat, how do we make it more effective? Be honest. Cut out the garbage. Test out your stuff. You know those funny MMA fighters try out women's self-defense technique videos that I do on this channel? Well, the whole moral of that story is test out your techniques. A lot of people comment on those videos, well, if you do it this way or that way, then it might work. I'm like, might? We don't want to trust our lives with might. Test it out and find out if it will work. That's the key. Next. Our next question comes from Bubble Whip, who says, Ramsey, should you learn wrestling and Jiu-Jitsu for MMA from an MMA coach like yourself, or a wrestling or Jiu-Jitsu specialist who has more experience in the speciality? My answer is yes. Yes to all of the above, and here's why. You should learn Jiu-Jitsu and wrestling for MMA from somebody familiar with the nuances of mixed martial arts, and you should also learn it from a specialist who specializes in Jiu-Jitsu or MMA. Because when that's all they do, they pick up some really, really interesting and useful stuff that a generalist does not. At the same time, an MMA coach, if you will, should not simply be a generalist, but a specialist in the sport of mixed martial arts. With Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and wrestling, for example, you have to throw a lot of that stuff in the garbage when you turn it into cage fighting. Chael Sonnen famously said there are 2 or 3 things from wrestling that work without question in MMA. Everything else, you either throw it in the garbage or you have to modify it heavily. Something like that. And that is absolutely true with every martial art. Jiu-Jitsu, man. Roger Gracie, again, famously said 80% of Jiu-Jitsu doesn't work in MMA. And I absolutely agree with that. Everything involving the gi, take off that uniform, you got to throw that stuff in the garbage for MMA. But it's not just that. It is all of the subtleties, and sometimes not so subtleties, about bridging the gap between striking and grappling and clinch fighting and striking and clinch fighting and throws and takedowns and guard passing and ground and pound and striking and all this stuff put together into this very unique sport where the stances are different, where the posturing is different, where the positioning is different. So a lot of times you will see boxers, for example. They'll look at MMA fighters striking And they'll say, those guys, their boxing is garbage. Look at their stance. Look at their position. Look at the way they're moving. Okay? And I'll give them the fact that most MMA fighters are not great boxers. A lot of them aren't even good boxers. A lot of them aren't even fair to middling boxers. However, if you approach the striking game in mixed martial arts the same way you do in boxing, with the same posture, the same footwork, the same positioning, you're going to get killed pretty quickly. And the same is true for every other sport, because it's an importantly different sport. The ranges are different. The precautions you have to take are different. And a lot of you are probably wondering, like what? Well, like everything. That's why you need a coach to guide you through all of these phases of combat. So yeah, at my gym, for example, we have 2 excellent wrestling coaches to teach you all kinds of stuff about wrestling that I can't give you, who have all kinds of experience that I don't have. But when it comes to cage fighting, we need to make modifications. And that's where I come in. Next question. Our last question comes from our friend M. One initial, capital M. He says, Ramsey Dewey, do you think Michael Jai White and Scott Adkins would do well in the UFC? Short answer, no. No, I do not. Now, both of those men are fantastic performers. Great martial arts action stars. And it's not just because they are martial arts action stars, actors, movie stars, whatever you want to call them, that I would say they would not do well in the UFC. Let's look at a few facts. Michael Jai White is 51 years old. How many 51-year-old UFC fighters can you name who are currently competing in the UFC? Now, your question wasn't just could they compete in the UFC at, say, the entry level. You said, can they do well? How many 51-year-old UFC champions can you name? Now, I'm 40 years old, and that's no spring chicken. And I'm not going to count out people and say, well, you can't fight because of your age. However, I'm going to tell you honestly, fighting and fighting at the highest level are 2 radically different things. Now, Michael Jai White is a fantastic performer and a fantastic athlete, especially given his age. And he's got black belts in everything, in all these different karate styles and taekwondo and even Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. He recently got a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt as well. And so I wouldn't say, that he'd get killed instantly, but he's not going to do that well in the UFC. I would also say that because that's not what he has spent his life training for. Scott Adkins. I don't know exactly how old he is, but he's younger, I think, than Michael Jai White. If you look at his resume of martial arts training, there is little or no grappling experience. And if you have little or no grappling experience, you're going to get stomped on. You're going to find out what a TKO loss on the ground or a submission feels like pretty quick. So, yeah, I love watching these guys in the movies. They're fantastic, inspirational performers. But, man, let's be honest, let's be frank. You can't just pick a guy who's in great shape for his age and say, hey, how would this guy do in such and such a professional sport? I mean, how would Michael Jai White do in pro football right now? He'd probably get squished in the NFL almost instantly. How would he do in pro soccer? Those young guys would run circles around him. How would he do in professional baseball? Probably not great, because those are not his areas of expertise. So, thanks for the questions. If you have any other questions, please leave them in the comments down below or email me at ramseydewey@gmail.com. Thank you for watching. Now get out there and train.